So I just put a little example of lace, just an actual handmade piece of lace. So when the Industrial Revolution arrived in Europe, it literally put whole industries out of business. So generations and generations of people were taught this timeless skill of making lace. It's called tattering. It was done by hand. It was very special. And it might have taken, months to create a small, delicate piece of lace. With the Industrial Revolution and the machine, that same piece of lace could be made in minutes. So literally, just entire towns, their livelihood was wiped out. On the other hand, now lace was more accessible to larger populations. And then what comes around goes around. There's always that return to the craft and return to the hand craftsmanship. So you can see lace coming back in small areas again today, that handmade lace. I also wanted to, this isn't in your textbook, but here in Arizona, window treatments, these very open weaves called casement fabrics, they're popular. They're popular because they offer just that kind of nice textural quality to window coverings. So a Lino weave is kind of very specific. It almost looks like macrame if you look very close. I mean, this is obviously a detail and up close, but it's the same process that traditional fishermen's nets were made. And basically, yarns are woven around the warp yarns, and it creates this very open, net-like type of design. So I threw a couple things in today's lecture that aren't in the textbook, just because you do come across these terms quite a bit as a designer, as well as working here in Arizona. So take a look at some of these open weaves. If you get a rustic style or a modern style for your final project, Kravet has these available for you to order. So I feel like there's only a paragraph in your textbook about compound construction, textile construction. Compound meaning two things coming together to create a textile, two or more things coming together. So in your textbook, it first talks about, before we look at compound, it also points out that not all fabrics are made with yarn. So I brought that to your attention before. Not all fabrics are made with yarn. Some are made without yarn. So here you're looking at a beautiful, high-performance sofa made in imitation suede. Just check out swatch 111. And first of all, it doesn't move as much as the knits, making it a better choice for upholstery. So if it's not knitted and it's not woven, how is this performance fabric created? So this is an example of something that is extruded, like a film. So it's that same process that we looked at when we looked at yarns, how yarns was extruded from a liquid state. Well, instead of being extruded into a fine filament, this is extruded into a film. It could then be napped or brushed to create this imitation of suede. It could be embossed, to look like an alligator or something like that. So if any of you maybe can talk about, I will just let you know, imitation or vegan suede, you will get tired of your upholstery piece before the fabric dies. It's like nothing. That's why it's called imitation suede, sometimes vegan suede, sometimes ultra suede. It's ultra marvelous. So my sister purchased suede sofa and love seat. She purchased it from a model home, so that means it sat in the model home for a couple years. She's had it in her house I don't know, I think we're going on like 15 years or something like that. And it still looks as new as the day she had it. It's been passed on now to her kids who now have them in their apartments. So you'll notice that there's a lack of grain. That grain, so it actually doesn't look quite like an animal. There's no grain, but that grain can be stamped or embossed in there should someone want that. And they would make that selection. These are just kind of quickly gone over in the textbook, but there's some specific types of embroidery that I would like you to know. So these are pillows from seasons ago of Pottery Barn. And it's an example of a specific type of embroidery called a crewel. So a compound textile consists of one or more layers. They are termed a compound cloth. And so the first example that we'll look at is embroidery. So on the right, you'll see like just a detail of something that's embroidered. So again, people have always embroidered by hand. The important thing to know is that there is a cloth complete from the design. So if someone was to pull off the embroidery, that ground cloth or that base cloth is still there. So it's another compounded addition to embellish the cloth with needle and thread. So again, starting with a cloth and then adding the stitching on top of it. And so this is different than a brocade. So you're going to look at the stitches and you're going to see that the stitches go in all different directions. So most of us probably have had like our logo or something embroidered on a hat or our team uniform or something like that. So the stitches go in all different directions. They're not confined to the loom. So there is just a few variations. These examples are of needlepoint pillows. They're available to you from Williams-Sonoma Home. They often carry needlepoint pillows. Needlepoint is an example of hand embroidery. It utilizes round stitches. And again, there's a base cloth underneath these round stitches. So there's a base cloth or a scrim, which means a very fine base cloth. And then these rounded stitches are completed to the surface. Unlike just traditional embroidery in the last slide, in needlepoint, typically the entire surface is covered. So if you are a fan of history and you watch all the ladies, from the Middle Ages, Renaissance, 17th, 18th century, you'll see all the women working on their needlepoint. And these were very time-consuming tasks. So oftentimes when we see needlepoint in interiors, they're for very small areas. So a pillow, some type of cushion, maybe they're framed as art. If you're a king, you can have a needlepoint rug. But for most of the others out there, it was kind of these small things for just small areas and embroidery, pillows, etc. Here's an example of needlepoint area rugs. Again, all those small knots covering the surface. So again, these are more embellished and raised on top of a surface where grow points happen during the weaving process. They're on a loom. So that's the difference between the two. They look quite a bit the same. I would like you to know, and I have several examples for when we get back together, of some beautiful crewel embroidery. Crewel embroidery. So this is a specific type of embroidery. It's typically made very popular during the Jacobean era to begin. Wool yarn is embroidered onto coarse cotton. So you had this coarse cotton foundation, and then dyed wool yarns were placed on top. This could be done by hand or today by machine. And how you know something is a crewel is by the type of stitches. So the type of stitches look like little links. So the stitches look like chain links. Traditional crewels typically were of trees and branches and vines. If you're studying your history class, if you're in History 1 and you're getting to the English Renaissance, you'll see some of those on canopy beds, really heavy canopy beds. Typically, they had the leaves, flowers, and exotic fruits. So this is an atypical crewel design, but it's still the crewel type of stitching. So candle wicking is basically the poor man's crewel. So it's a decorative stitching or a decorative embroidery again. But candle wicking was more associated with American colonial years. So back in Europe, people saw examples of beautiful crewel embroideries. And they come to America and they just don't have access to all that wool. They just don't have, fields of sheep. So they have to kind of create an effect with what they have. And so it's called candle wicking because candle cords or candle wicks were traditionally made of cotton. So this tone on tone or cotton on cotton type of stitching design is called candle wicking. Traditionally, in terms of patterns, it's traditionally very American colonial folksy types of designs, not as sophisticated as its crewel European counterpart. So cross stitch or fancy work is another form of embroidery. In cross stitch, there's all types of cross stitch kits available, still today in pretty much any craft store. The fabric used to embroider upon needs to be held tight. So that's where you see them, like if you go to the craft store, you see the stitching rings. So like the circle rings or the square rings, so it holds it very taut and tight. And then all these X stitches are then placed in to create the design. So these are collector's items and very valuable, from maybe from the Shakers or the Amish or from history. Again, kind of Americana aesthetic, a little more American country. That hasn't been back for a while. So ginghams and plaids and red, white, and blue. Maybe we'll see Americana come back. So then we move to machine type of embroidery. And I have a sample here, sample 116. So this is done on the Schiffley machine, a type of machine that creates this really complicated and dense type of embroidery. So there are many different variations to that. They're often used on these very lightweight fabrics. And number 116 is an example of an eyelet. So in an eyelet, there are holes punched out or cut out of the fabric. And then to secure that hole and to surround that hole, there's embroidery that goes around the edges and then any type of other design that wants to go with it. So that's an example of an eyelet. Where would you use this as an interior designer? Definitely for window treatments, or if you want any sheer element on any type of bedding or something, but definitely eyelets are used in window treatments, really adorable for bedding, for like girls' rooms or nurseries. It just has that delicate quality associated with children's bedding. Swatch number 115 next to this is an example of a quilted fabric. So this is different than the double weave, which was created on the loom. A quilted fabric is 3 fabric layers held together by a decorative stitch. So that's why it falls under the stitching. So if you look at sample 115, there is a fabric on the bottom, a knit. Then in between it, there is a non-woven batting. And then on top, probably just a filament satin or something like that. And then it's quilted. All those 3 layers are quilted together. So through all 3 layers to create that effect. And there are different types of quilting patterns that you will need to know as an interior designer. And so I probably need to just kind of stop so that you focus on this. If you're creating bedding, so I'm going to have you think about you're creating a bedding. If you do not quilt it, it's basically a duvet. A duvet means there's a top piece and a bottom piece, and you slip something in between it. It's not quilted. So you may think that most bedding out there are duvets, but take a look, because I have 3 designers that are on tonight or today. Take a look. There's a lot of quilting going on. It's not the old quilting of our grandmothers, you know, old quilted bedding from the 60s and 70s. It's really quite charming. So there's different types of quilting patterns, and they're done. A little cam is put on a machine, and any quilted pattern that you want can be done. Stars, diamonds, simple tufts. Channels are straight lines. Outlines outline an area. So for example, when I used to do kids' rooms, I just have to give you some examples. Maybe I would do a bedding that had moons and stars on the fabric. And maybe I would quilt around the moons, or maybe I would quilt around the stars or something to create the quilt. Squares are simple squares. So channel 2 directions up and down to create the square, or on angles to create a diamond, or just something simply tufted. So this is just, here I just wanted to show you even the inserts. What goes inside a duvet is quilted. So these are quilted duvets. There's our fuzzy knit. That's probably chenille channels. And then our pillows are just the inserts. There's a difference between the term a quilt and quilted or quilting. So a quilt is generally cutouts of fabric, for in this example, squares that are sewn together. All these different fabrics that have been sewn together, that makes it a quilt. This is a quilt that is quilted. So not only is it the patchwork quilt, but then all of these channels have been put in and alternating angles to be quilted. And then the squares themselves have to be quilted for the 3 layers, the batting, the top layer of the quilt pattern, and then the bottom layer, which is usually a solid. The image on the right is bedding that has been quilted. So you can see in this example, the fabric was a red fabric with some easy floral arrangements, and you can see that the floral design has been quilted around to create that design.